They committed horrific war crimes to build their colony. They never expected a hero to rise from the ashes. This is the story of the brutal French colonization of Burkina Faso and the revolutionary leader who dared to fight back. We expose the brutal reality of the French conquest of Burkina Faso, then known as Upper Volta. We uncover a history of systemic war crimes against humanity, from massacres during the pacification campaigns to the slavery-like conditions of forced labor that decimated the population. But this is not just a story of victimization. It's a story of resistance and the rise of a true African hero, Thomas Sankara, in modern days of history. Known as Africa's Che Guevara, Sankara led a revolution to reclaim his nation's dignity, renaming it Burkina Faso, Land of Incorruptible People. We explore his fight against the legacy of French colonialism and the neo-colonial forces that ultimately led to his assassination. How are you, friends? I am Czar. Welcome to episode 9 of the French conquest of Burkina Faso. Earlier, we discussed other North African countries. The people of Burkina Faso originate from several distinct historical migrations and ethnic groups, with the Mossi people forming the largest and most historically dominant group. The nation's ethnic landscape was largely shaped by the rise and fall of powerful kingdoms, particularly the Mossi kingdoms, beginning in the 15th century. The people of Burkina Faso originate from several distinct historical migrations and ethnic groups, with the Mossi people forming the largest and most historically dominant group. The nation's ethnic landscape was largely shaped by the rise and fall of powerful kingdoms, particularly the Mossi kingdoms, beginning in the 15th century. Before the arrival of the Mossi, the land was inhabited by a mosaic of distinct ethnic groups, many of whom still form a significant part of Burkina Faso's population. These include the Bobo, who live in the west around Bobo Dioulasso and are known for their farming traditions and distinctive masks. The Sinufo and Lobi, located in the southwest, are known for their matrilineal societies and skilled artistry. The Gurunsi, who live in the south-central region. These groups were generally organized into decentralized communities of farmers and hunters and had established deep cultural and spiritual roots in the land long before the formation of centralized states. The French invasion of the territories that now form Burkina Faso was a campaign of terror against civilians because its methods were designed to break the will of the entire population, not just to defeat the Mossi armies on the battlefield. This strategy of pacification relied on collective punishment and massacres, particularly after the formal capture of the capital. The French invasion of the territories that now form Burkina Faso was a campaign of terror against civilians because its methods were designed to break the will of the entire population, not just to defeat the Mossi armies on the battlefield. This strategy of pacification relied on collective punishment and massacres, particularly after the formal capture of the capital. Before the invasion, the French sought to subordinate the powerful Mossi Empire through diplomacy. However, the Mossi Emperor, the Mogo Naba Wabgo, famously rejected their advances. In 1895, he told the French envoy, "I know the whites claim they want to help me organize my country, but I find my country fine just the way it is." This refusal prompted a military response. A French column of about 500 soldiers, led by Lieutenant Paul Voulay, marched on the Mossi capital. On September 1, 1896, the French force captured Ouagadougou with little resistance. The Mogo Naba Wabgo and his court, realizing their army's cavalry was no match for French machine guns, had evacuated the city to organize resistance from the countryside. This is the crucial turning point. From this moment, the French objective was no longer to defeat a state, but to hunt down a leader supported by his people. The war transformed into a campaign against any civilian suspected of aiding the resistance. The months following the capture of Ouagadougou were defined by terror. French columns pursued Naba Wabgo and systematically punished any region that supported him. This was not a war between armies, but a series of punitive raids. Any village that resisted French authority or was suspected of hiding resistance fighters was designated an enemy. The entire community, men, women, and children, was held responsible. French soldiers would burn these villages to the ground, systematically destroying homes, grain stores, and livestock. This was a deliberate strategy to induce famine and make it impossible for the population to support the resistance. Resistance, however small, was met with disproportionate force. Entire villages were massacred to serve as a terrifying example to neighboring communities. These actions were not collateral damage, but the primary tool of subjugation. The methods used in Burkina Faso were epitomized by the infamous Voulez-Chanoine mission. While this mission's objective was to conquer Chad, its march across the Sahel in 1898 and 1899 demonstrated the peak of this terror strategy. The mission became a rogue, infernal column, leaving a trail of destruction, rape, and mass graves of civilians. This mission's actions are the most well-documented example of the type of pacification campaign used to subdue the entire region, including Burkina Faso. The French invasion was a campaign of terror because after the initial, brief military confrontation, the war was deliberately turned against the civilian population. By making daily life an ordeal of fear, starvation, and death, the French aimed to make the cost of resistance unbearable, a strategy fundamentally different from a conventional war between armies. Mogho Nabawabgo was the last independent emperor of the Mossi Kingdom of Ouagadougou, and his capture and exile represent the destruction of his society because he was not just a king, but the sacred center of the Mossi world. Mogho Nabawabgo reigned 1889 to 1897, whose name means the elephant, was the 34th Mogho Naba, or emperor of Ouagadougou. This was the most powerful of the Mossi kingdoms, which had dominated the region of modern-day Burkina Faso for over 400 years. In the 1890s, during the Scramble for Africa, France sought to force a protectorate treaty on the Mossi. Nabawabgo famously refused, telling a French envoy, "I find my country fine just the way it is." In response, a French military column invaded. On September 1st, 1896, they captured his capital, Ouagadougou. Nabawabgo escaped and led a fierce, year-long resistance. He was eventually betrayed and captured by the British in the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, in 1897 and handed over to the French, who exiled him to Zungeru in Nigeria, where he died in 1904. The French imposed a head tax, impôt de capitation, that had to be paid in French currency. This was a strategic trap. Since most Burkinabé were subsistence farmers who did not use cash, the only way for men to earn French francs was to abandon their own farms and families to work for colonial enterprises. This system was the primary driver of forced labor, travail forcé. Men were compelled to work on cotton plantations, infrastructure projects like railways, or for private French companies under brutal conditions, often for little more than the amount needed to pay the tax. The tax was a tool to create a cheap, captive labor force. Historical accounts confirm that rape and gang rape were committed by French forces during the conquest and colonial rule of Burkina Faso. This sexual violence was not a series of isolated incidents, but a feature of the pacification campaigns and a tool of colonial domination. The most infamous and well-documented example of these atrocities was the Voulez-Chanoine mission in 1898 to 1899. This French military column, which carved a path of destruction across the Sahel, including regions of modern-day Burkina Faso, became notorious for its systematic violence. Historical records and witness accounts document that the soldiers of this infernal column routinely engaged in massacres, pillaging, and the abduction and rape of local women as they moved from village to village. While official colonial records rarely documented these crimes for obvious reasons, the evidence that exists in military archives, personal journals, and academic research confirms that sexual violence was an inherent part of the brutal reality of the French conquest in the region. When people could not pay, which was often the French colonial administration and their local enforcers, the feared garde du cercle used a predictable ladder of violent coercion. This was the most common initial punishment. Colonial officials would enter a village and seize the women and children, holding them as hostages in a central hut or compound. They were often denied food and held in inhumane conditions until the men of the village could produce the required sum of money, forcing them into desperate measures to save their families. This practice is widely documented in French administrative reports from the era. Men who failed to pay were subjected to routine torture. The most common tool was the chicotte, a hippo-hide whip that tore flesh from the bone. Men would be publicly flogged to terrorize the community into compliance. Other documented methods included being tied to a post and left in the scorching sun for days, or being subjected to other forms of extreme physical abuse. This was the ultimate collective punishment for a village that collectively resisted or failed to meet its tax quota. A punitive military expedition would be sent with orders to make an example of the village. Soldiers would loot any valuables, seize livestock, and then systematically burn every hut and grain store to the ground. This scorched earth tactic ensured the community would face famine and destitution, breaking their ability to resist in the future. All of this brutality was justified under the banner of the civilizing mission, Mission Civilisatrice. The French claimed they were teaching the Burkinabe the dignity of work and instilling a sense of civic duty. In reality, this was a racist ideology that framed Africans as lazy and inferior, thus rationalizing extreme violence as a necessary tool of education and progress. Furthermore, the system was directly linked to military conscription. Young men from non-compliant villages could be forcibly conscripted into the tirailleurs sénégalais as a form of punishment, sent to fight and die in France's wars abroad. For others, volunteering was a desperate escape from the never-ending cycle of forced labor and tax debt. This entire structure of violent enforcement reveals a system where the civilized ideals were merely a thin veil for terror and exploitation. To a large extent, the extreme poverty in Burkina Faso today is a direct legacy of the French colonial economic system. That system was never designed to develop the country, but to extract maximum wealth for France, creating deep structural weaknesses that still cripple the nation. The French only built infrastructure, like roads and rails, that served to get resources out of the country to the coast. They did not build networks to connect the Burkinabe people or create a domestic market. The country was left with no foundation for a self-sustaining economy. The French invested almost nothing in education for the African population. At independence, the literacy rate was below 10%. This left the new nation without the doctors, engineers, and administrators needed to build a modern state. While post-colonial issues like the CFA franc, which limited monetary sovereignty, a history of coups, and the recent jihadist insurgency have massively compounded the problem, they all act upon a fragile structure that was built by the French. The colonial system was designed to create poverty for the many and wealth for a few, and that is a legacy Burkina Faso is still fighting to overcome. The decolonization process began after World War II as France's global power weakened. The key steps were political and gradual. Growing self-rule, 1956 to 1957. The French Loi Cadre Framework Law of 1956 granted its African colonies more self-governance. In 1957, a territorial assembly was established in what was then called French Upper Volta. A leading political figure, Daniel Ouessine Coulibaly, became the head of the local government. The 1958 referendum. The pivotal moment was the French constitutional referendum on September 28, 1958. African colonies were given a choice. Vote yes to become an autonomous republic within the new French community. Vote no for immediate and total independence, but with the complete withdrawal of all French aid and support. Led by its political class, Upper Volta voted overwhelmingly yes. After Daniel Ouessine Coulibaly died just before the referendum, his successor, Maurice Yameogo, took charge. On December 11, 1958, the country was declared the Autonomous Republic of Upper Volta, with Yameogo as its leader. The French community model did not last long, as most territories quickly pushed for full sovereignty. Recognizing the inevitable, France agreed to grant complete independence. On August 5, 1960, the Republic of Upper Volta was declared a fully independent nation. Maurice Yameogo became the country's first president. This peaceful political process is distinct from the later revolutionary period of the 1980s led by Thomas Sankara, who renamed the country Burkina Faso. France has never paid any compensation to Burkina Faso. The Catholic Church was used not to civilize the local population, but instead as a tool of colonization. No justice was ever served publicly by the Church. This figure primarily counts people who were born in Burkina Faso and later moved to France. The total number of people of Burkinabe origin living in France including their French-born children and grandchildren, is estimated to be significantly larger, likely between 70,000 and 80,000 people. The diplomatic ties between the two countries were established the same year. Later on, Thomas Sankara raised his voice against France and did many things for the public of his country, but unfortunately, he was assassinated in a military coup d'etat on October 15, 1987. The coup was organized and led by his close friend and second-in-command, Blaise Compaoré, who immediately seized power and ruled Burkina Faso for the next 27 years. Sankara was killed along with 12 other officials by a hit squad of soldiers during a meeting at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The attack was sudden and brutal, eliminating the entire revolutionary leadership in one stroke. The departure followed a formal request made in January 2023 by Burkina Faso's ruling military junta, led by Ibrahim Traore, which gave France 1 month to withdraw its forces. The roughly 400 French soldiers were part of a special forces deployment known as Oppression.Ever, based in Camboinsen, on the outskirts of the capital, Ouagadougou. A flag-lowering ceremony was held on February 19, 2023, to officially mark the end of the mission and the French military presence in the country. This event was part of a major geopolitical shift in the Sahel, following similar French military withdrawals from Mali in 2022 and preceding the one from Niger later in 2023, amid deteriorating relations between France and the region's new military governments. Now that you know how Burkina Faso achieved independence, you're ready for the next step. In my next video, we're going to cover the next African country, so make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss it. And if you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next.